I'm Amber Sullivan, 28, and I never thought I'd wake up from a 3-month coma to discover my own parents had abandoned me at the hospital. They left me drowning in medical bills while they started a new life in Florida. But nothing could have prepared any of us for that moment in court when they finally saw what their betrayal had done to me, and they literally collapsed. Before my accident, I thought I knew what family meant. I was wrong. Before I dive into my story, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button if you've ever felt abandoned by those who should have loved you most. Now, let me take you back to when everything was still normal. Before my world shattered into a million pieces, I had what most would consider a pretty great life. I was working as a marketing executive for a growing tech company in Boston, living in a cute apartment in Cambridge that I'd decorated exactly how I wanted it, and I was finally making enough money to put a decent amount into savings each month. I'd worked hard to get there, climbing the corporate ladder with determination that my father always said I'd inherited from him. My parents, Richard and Karen Sullivan, lived in a comfortable suburban home about 30 minutes outside the city. Dad was a respected attorney specializing in corporate law, and Mom was the principal at one of the top-rated high schools in Massachusetts. From the outside, we were the picture-perfect American family, complete with Sunday dinners that I never missed. It was our tradition. I'd drive over around 4, Mom would cook something elaborate, and Dad would pour wine while telling me about his latest case or asking about my work. "You're just like me, Amber," he'd say, swirling his red wine with a satisfied smile. "You've got that drive. You know what you want and you go after it." Just 2 weeks before the accident, I'd received a promotion at work. Marketing director at 28, it was a big deal. My parents threw a small celebration dinner, inviting some family friends and making a toast that made me tear up. "To our brilliant daughter," Dad had said, raising his glass. "We always knew you were destined for greatness." Mom had hugged me tightly that night. "We're so proud of you, honey. Everything you've achieved is because of your hard work and the values we instilled in you." I believed them completely. Why wouldn't I? They had always been there, guiding my decisions, celebrating my victories, helping me through disappointments. They paid for my college education at Boston University, helped me furnish my first apartment, and were always just a phone call away with advice. It was my best friend Jessica who first pointed out something I couldn't see. "Your parents are kind of controlling, don't you think?" she asked one night over cocktails, about a month before the accident. I laughed it off. "They're just involved. They care about me." Jessica wasn't convinced. "There's involved, and then there's having an opinion about every single decision you make. Remember when you were considering that job in New York and they talked you out of it?" I remembered. It had been a great opportunity with a prestigious agency, but my parents had laid out all the reasons Boston was better, closer to them, lower cost of living compared to Manhattan, the network I'd already established. Their arguments made sense at the time, so I stayed. "That was my choice," I told Jessica firmly. "They just helped me see the pros and cons." "And what about every guy you've dated?" "They found something wrong with all of them." She wasn't entirely wrong about that. My parents had high standards for who I should be with, but I'd always thought that was normal. They wanted the best for me. "They just want me to find someone who deserves me," I said defensively. Jessica sighed. "Look, your parents obviously love you. I'm just saying it wouldn't hurt for you to make some decisions without their input sometimes." I changed the subject, but her words stuck with me. It was true that my parents had been deeply involved in every major decision of my life, where I went to college, what I studied, where I lived, who I dated. I'd never really rebelled as a teenager. I was the good daughter who made them proud. By 28, I had achieved a level of financial independence, but emotionally, I still sought their approval for almost everything. My apartment was my own space, filled with books, plants, and artwork I loved, but even there, I had incorporated many of their suggestions about furniture and decor. And then there was Michael. We'd been dating for 6 months before the accident, and he was different from the guys I usually brought home to meet my parents. He was a freelance photographer, creative, free-spirited, and not particularly concerned with the corporate ladder or 401k plans. My parents had been polite but cool toward him at our first dinner together. "He seems nice enough," Mom said afterward, "but I'm not sure he's reliable, honey." "Does he even have health insurance?" "He's talented, Mom. His work has been featured in major magazines." Dad had chimed in then. "Creative careers are risky, Amber. You're building something stable. You need someone who complements that, not complicates it." The week before the accident, Michael and I had our first major fight. He'd invited me on a weekend trip to Maine, which meant I would miss Sunday dinner for the first time in years. When I told my parents, their reaction was stronger than I expected. "You see this boy a few months and suddenly family traditions don't matter?" Dad had asked, his voice sharp with disappointment. "It's just one Sunday, Dad. We'll do dinner next week." Mom had looked genuinely hurt. "We've always had our Sundays, Amber. Always." That night, I called Michael and told him I was reconsidering the trip. He was frustrated. "You're 28, Amber. You don't need your parents' permission to take a weekend trip with your boyfriend." I knew he was right, but the guilt was overwhelming. After a sleepless night, I made a decision. I called Michael the next morning. "I'm coming on the trip," I said. "You're right. I need to start making my own choices." He was surprised but happy. We planned to leave early Saturday morning, spend the weekend hiking and photographing the beautiful Maine coastline, and return late Sunday night. I texted my mother that I wouldn't be at dinner, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in my stomach. Her response was brief. "We're very disappointed in your choice, Amber." It was the last text she ever sent me before the accident that would change everything. The morning of our trip dawned rainy and gray. I remember checking my phone before we left, seeing another text from my mother, "I hope you reconsider. Your father is very upset." I showed Michael the message and sighed. "Maybe we should just postpone." He looked at me with gentle frustration. "Amber, this is exactly what I'm talking about. One weekend away isn't abandoning your family. It's normal adult behavior." I knew he was right. I replied to my mother, "I love you both, but I'm going. We'll talk when I get back." We loaded Michael's old Jeep Cherokee with our bags, camera equipment, and snacks for the drive. The rain was coming down harder as we hit the highway heading north. Michael was driving carefully, but visibility was poor. We were listening to a playlist he'd made for the trip, talking about the coastal spots he wanted to photograph. I remember laughing at something he said. I remember reaching to turn up a song I liked. I remember the sudden glare of headlights through the driver's side window, much closer than they should have been. Then came the deafening crash of metal on metal. The world spun violently. Glass shattered. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, when I looked over at Michael and saw his expression of shock and fear. Then nothing. My next fragmented memory is of lights, too bright, and voices shouting medical terms I didn't understand. Pain everywhere. Someone saying severe head trauma and internal bleeding. A glimpse of my parents' faces, Mom crying, Dad ashen. Then darkness again. I learned later what happened. A drunk driver had crossed the center line and hit us directly on the driver's side at high speed. Michael died instantly. The other driver walked away with minor injuries. I was extracted from the mangled Jeep by first responders and airlifted to Massachusetts General Hospital with catastrophic injuries, traumatic brain injury, internal bleeding, a shattered pelvis, broken ribs, collapsed lung, and a broken arm. Emergency surgery saved my life, but the brain injury was severe. I slipped into a coma that would last for 3 months. The medical reports I read later described my condition in clinical terms. Patient remains unresponsive to stimuli but maintains stable vital signs. Glasgow Coma Scale score of 6. Diffuse axonal injury with uncertain prognosis for recovery. What those reports couldn't describe was what it was like inside the coma. People think it's like being asleep, but it's nothing like that. It's more like being trapped in a dark, shifting place where time has no meaning. Sometimes I could hear voices, distant and distorted, but couldn't respond. Sometimes there was nothing but the void. In the early days, I heard my parents often. Mom crying, Dad asking doctors endless questions about my prognosis, treatment options, experimental procedures. Will she wake up? Mom would ask, her voice breaking. It's impossible to say with certainty, the doctor would reply. The brain is unpredictable. Some patients with similar injuries recover fully, others partially, and some never regain consciousness. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't open my eyes, but some part of me was still there, listening, drifting in and out of awareness. Weeks passed. I know this now, but then, time was meaningless. The conversations I heard changed. My parents started talking about costs, insurance coverage, long-term care options. Their voices came less frequently. The insurance coverage is maxing out, I heard my father say once. We're looking at hundreds of thousands in ongoing care. What about our retirement? My mother's voice was tight with worry. We can't spend everything we've saved. I know. I'm looking into options. The last conversation I remember clearly was about 3 months after the accident. They didn't know I could hear them. The doctors say she might never wake up, Karen. My father's voice was resigned. And if she does, she might not be our Amber anymore. Brain damage, years of rehabilitation. What choice do we have? My mother sounded tired, defeated. We can't do this anymore. His voice was firm. We need to think about our future too. After that, their voices disappeared entirely. In their place came a new voice, Nurse Rachel. She talked to me every day while checking my vitals, adjusting my position to prevent bed sores, performing physical therapy on my limbs to prevent atrophy. Good morning, Amber, she would say cheerfully. It's Tuesday, August 15th, rainy today, but they say it'll clear up later. Let's get you turned over and do your exercises. She would tell me about her day, her kids, books she was reading, news events. Sometimes she would read to me from novels or magazines. Her voice became my anchor to reality. The doctors say your brain activity is increasing, she told me one day. I think you're in there, fighting to come back. Keep fighting, honey. I was fighting. Somewhere in the darkness, I was struggling to find my way back. Gradually, I became more aware. I could sense light through my closed eyelids. I could feel the texture of the sheets against my skin. One day, I moved my finger slightly when Rachel asked me to try. Oh my God, she gasped. You did it. You moved your finger. Doctor. She responded. The next few days were a blur of tests, more doctors, more voices. And then, finally, I opened my eyes. The world was painfully bright, blurry, and confusing. A face came into focus, a woman with kind eyes and dark curly hair pulled back in a ponytail. Nurse Rachel. Welcome back, Amber, she said, tears in her eyes. You've been asleep for a long time. Waking up from a 3-month coma isn't like in the movies. There was no dramatic moment where I suddenly sat up in bed, fully alert and aware. It was a gradual, confusing process. First came the ability to open my eyes, then to focus them, to follow movement. Speech returned haltingly, simple words at first, slurred and difficult to form. My body felt like it belonged to someone else, weak, unresponsive, strange. The first clear question I managed to ask was about Michael. I knew the answer before Rachel spoke, I saw it in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Amber, she said gently. Michael didn't survive the accident. I cried then, the tears feeling strange on my face, my sobs weak and breathless. Rachel held my hand through it, not rushing me, not offering empty platitudes. When I was calm enough to speak again, I asked the question that had been forming in my confused mind. My parents? Rachel hesitated, and in that hesitation I knew something was very wrong. Let me get Dr. Patel, she said. He can explain everything. Dr. Patel was a neurologist in his 50s with a gentle manner and direct gaze. He explained my injuries, my coma, the treatments they had provided, and my expected recovery process. Then he paused, looking uncomfortable. Amber, I need to tell you something difficult. Your parents were here regularly during the first few weeks after your accident. But about a month into your coma, they stopped coming. I stared at him, not comprehending. What do you mean, stopped coming? They informed the hospital that they would no longer be responsible for your care. They've changed their contact information and moved from their previous residence. The words made no sense. Parents don't abandon their children in comas. That doesn't happen in real life. There must be a mistake, I said, my voice shaking. Call them again. We've tried, Amber. The numbers we have are disconnected. We sent letters to their home address, but they were returned unopened. I insisted they try my parents' workplaces. Surely they were still at the law firm and the high school. But no, my father had taken early retirement, and my mother had resigned from her position. No forwarding contact information provided. The reality began to sink in, heavy and suffocating. My parents had abandoned me. Left me alone in a hospital bed, uncertain if I would ever wake up. The people who had been at every school play, every graduation, every Sunday dinner, who had shaped every major decision in my life, had simply walked away when I needed them most. The physical pain of my injuries was nothing compared to this new wound. It felt like dying all over again. Recovery became a blur of physical therapy sessions, cognitive tests, and painful realizations. My muscles had atrophied during the coma, and I had to relearn basic movements. Walking was a distant goal. First, I had to master sitting up, then standing with support. Speech therapy helped with my slurred words and occasional aphasia. Occupational therapy taught me how to perform basic self-care again. Through it all, there was the constant, crushing awareness of abandonment. And something else, something almost as terrifying, money. A hospital administrator named Jim came to see me about 2 weeks after I woke up. Miss Sullivan, I need to discuss your financial situation, he said awkwardly. Your insurance coverage maxed out 5 weeks ago. Your parents initially covered some expenses but formally notified us they would no longer be responsible for your care. How much do I owe? I whispered. He named a figure that made me dizzy. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, growing every day I remained in the hospital. We're applying for emergency Medicaid coverage, he explained. But there's a process, and it doesn't cover everything. Once you're stable, we'll need to transfer you to a state facility for continued rehabilitation. A state facility. The kind of place with shared rooms, overworked staff, minimal therapy. The kind of place where recovery took longer, if it happened at all. That's when I met Emily Chen, a hospital social worker assigned to my case. Small and efficient, with a quiet determination, she took one look at my face after Jim left and said, "We're going to figure this out, Amber. You're not alone in this." I broke down in physical therapy that afternoon. I was trying to stand with a walker, my legs trembling violently, sweat pouring down my face from the effort. Suddenly, it all seemed pointless. I can't do this, I sobbed, collapsing back into the wheelchair. What am I fighting for? I wake up to find my boyfriend dead, my parents gone, my career over, and debt I can never repay. What's the point? My physical therapist, a tough love guy named Marcus, crouched in front of me. The point is that you're still here, Amber. You survived for a reason. And from what I've seen, you're not a quitter. Rachel and Emily became my lifelines. Rachel would come sit with me after her shifts ended, bringing me real coffee instead of the hospital's watery version, telling me about her kids' antics to make me smile. Emily worked tirelessly on my case, finding resources, applying for programs, advocating with the hospital administration for more time. Your parents can't just walk away from this, Emily said one day. There are filial responsibility laws in our state. They have a legal obligation to you. I tried to locate my parents through their old friends and colleagues. But it seemed they had cut ties with everyone who knew me. One of Dad's former law partners told me they had sold their house in a hurry, mentioned something about early retirement in Florida, and disappeared. "I'm sorry, Amber," he said awkwardly on the phone. Richard made it clear he didn't want to be contacted. "I had no idea about your situation. My apartment was long gone, the lease expired while I was in the coma, and my belongings had been put in storage, then sold when the storage fees weren't paid. My job had been filled by someone else. My car had been totaled in the accident. In the space of 3 months of unconsciousness, I had lost everything. But something else was happening too. For the first time in my life, I was making decisions entirely on my own. No parental guidance, no seeking approval. Just me, facing impossible circumstances, choosing how to respond. And I chose to fight. The day Emily introduced me to attorney Marcus Washington was the day I decided to stop being a victim and start being a plaintiff. Marcus was a former corporate lawyer who now worked pro bono cases through the hospital's legal aid program. Tall and imposing with prematurely gray hair, he had the kind of voice that commanded attention in a courtroom. Filial responsibility laws exist in about half of the states, he explained during our first meeting in my hospital room. Massachusetts is one of them. These laws establish a duty for adult children to care for their indigent parents, but they work both ways. Parents have a responsibility to care for adult children who cannot care for themselves due to disability or illness. My parents have money, I said. They're not refusing to help because they can't. They're refusing because they don't want to. Which makes their case even weaker, Marcus nodded. We have documented evidence that they were actively involved in your care, then abruptly abandoned you without medical justification. We have the hospital's records of their discussions about costs before they disappeared. But we don't know where they are, I pointed out. We'll find them, Marcus said with quiet confidence. That's step one. Marcus hired a private investigator named Diana who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. It took her just 2 weeks to locate my parents. They bought a condominium in Naples, Florida, she reported, spreading photos on my bedside table. Gated community, golf course views. They paid cash, $1.2 million. I stared at the photos in disbelief. There were my parents, tanned and relaxed, walking on a beach. My mother in a sun hat I'd never seen before. My father carrying golf clubs. Both smiling. While I lay fighting for my life, relearning how to speak, they were living in luxury on a golf course. They liquidated most of their investments before moving, Diana continued. But they still have substantial retirement accounts. Your father is doing some consulting work for local businesses. Your mother volunteers at an art gallery. My hand shook as I pushed the photos away. They look happy. Diana's expression softened. People who run away usually aren't, deep down. While the legal case moved forward, I continued the grueling work of recovery. Every day brought small victories, standing for 30 seconds longer, taking a few steps with the walker, remembering all the items on a memory test, feeding myself without dropping the fork. And every day brought painful reminders of what I'd lost. The hospital was planning to transfer me to a state rehabilitation facility. Marcus managed to get an emergency injunction preventing the transfer until our case against my parents could be heard, arguing that premature transfer could harm my recovery and our legal position. Meanwhile, I moved to a halfway house for medical patients who needed ongoing care but not hospitalization. My room was small but private, with a window overlooking a courtyard garden. The facility had group physical therapy sessions and a common room where patients gathered for meals and activities. There I met others whose lives had also been shattered by illness or injury: Dion, recovering from a stroke at 40, Lydia, rebuilding strength after a year-long battle with cancer, Trevor, learning to live with a spinal cord injury from a motorcycle accident. We formed a makeshift support group, celebrating each other's progress, commiserating over setbacks, sharing the unique grief that comes from having your life divided into before and after. My fiancé left 2 months after my accident, Trevor told me one evening as we sat in the courtyard. Said she couldn't handle being with someone in a wheelchair for the rest of her life. I'm sorry, I said. That's awful. He shrugged. At least she was honest about it. Your parents, man, that's cold. Just disappearing. I keep trying to understand it, I admitted. All my life, they seemed so devoted. I was their only child, their pride and joy. How do you go from that to abandonment? People show who they really are in a crisis, Trevor said. Maybe they were only devoted when it was easy. His words stayed with me. I thought about Jessica's observation that my parents had always been controlling. Had their love been conditional all along? Only available as long as I was the perfect daughter, following their approved life plan? The case preparation intensified. Marcus built a file documenting my parents' involvement in my early care, their sudden disappearance, their financial resources, and my ongoing medical needs. We prepared for depositions and the possibility of a trial. They'll probably try to settle, Marcus warned me. Their attorney will reach out once they're served with the lawsuit. They won't want this going public. I don't care about public, I said. I care about accountability. I practiced my testimony with Marcus, learning to tell my story clearly and factually, without letting emotion overwhelm me. It was harder than any physical therapy session. You were abandoned by your parents while in a coma following a catastrophic accident, Marcus reminded me. You're entitled to your anger. But in court, we need to present facts, not emotions. Save the emotion for when I ask you how their actions made you feel. The nightmares started around this time, vivid dreams about the accident, about waking up alone, about seeing my parents walking away from my hospital bed. I'd wake up gasping, disoriented, my heart racing. The halfway house night staff got used to checking on me at 3 a.m., bringing me tea, sitting with me until I could sleep again. Rachel and Emily visited regularly. Emily brought updates on the legal proceedings, while Rachel brought normalcy and friendship. My former colleagues from the marketing firm came by with a box of personal items they'd rescued from my desk before it was cleared for my replacement, photos, a favorite mug, small mementos that now represented my only possessions. As the court date approached, I progressed to using a cane instead of a walker. My speech was almost back to normal, though I still struggled to find words when tired. The cognitive test showed significant improvement, though the doctors warned there might be lasting effects from the brain injury, migraines, memory issues, difficulty with concentration. 2 days before the scheduled court appearance, my parents' attorney filed a motion to dismiss the case, arguing that as an adult, I had no legal claim to parental support. Marcus filed a compelling counter-argument citing the specific provisions of Massachusetts law and my temporary disability status. The judge denied the motion to dismiss. We were going to court. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I stood at the window of my room at the halfway house, looking out at the moonlit garden, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Would I finally get answers? Would I see remorse in their eyes? Or would they look at me like a stranger, a burden they'd chosen to leave behind? Whatever happened, I knew one thing with certainty. I wasn't the same Amber Sullivan who had gotten into that car on a rainy morning 9 months ago. That Amber had been defined by her parents' expectations and approval. This Amber was forging a new identity in the fire of abandonment and recovery. For the first time in my life, I was truly on my own. And somehow, despite everything, I was still standing. The courthouse was an imposing brick building in downtown Boston, with wide stone steps leading to heavy wooden doors. Marcus met me outside, carrying his briefcase and wearing his court suit, dark blue with a subtle pinstripe that he said juries responded well to. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm for support as I made my way up the steps with my cane. "As I'll ever be," I replied, my stomach in knots. Rachel had helped me dress that morning in clothes borrowed from Emily, a modest navy blue dress and low-heeled shoes that wouldn't compromise my still shaky balance. My hair, which had been partially shaved for brain surgery and had grown back unevenly, was styled in a way that minimized the visible scars. I wanted to look composed, capable, not like someone to be pitied. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood-paneled walls and uncomfortable-looking benches. A few reporters sat in the back. Marcus had warned me that the unusual nature of the case had attracted some media attention. Emily and Rachel sat directly behind our table, providing silent support. And then I saw them. My parents entered from a side door with their attorney, a sleek woman in an expensive suit. They looked older than in the Florida photos, my father's face more aligned, my mother's posture less confident. For a moment, our eyes met across the room, and I saw the shock register on their faces. Perhaps they'd expected me to still be in a wheelchair, more obviously damaged. Perhaps they hadn't expected me to show up at all. Their attorney whispered something to them, and they quickly looked away, taking their seats at the defense table. Neither made a move to approach me or acknowledge me further. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Harriet Wells entered, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She reviewed the case file before addressing the court. "This is an unusual application of our state's filial responsibility statutes," she noted. "But the law exists to protect vulnerable family members, and the court takes such obligations seriously. Let's proceed." Marcus presented our case first, laying out the facts methodically: my accident, the coma, my parents' initial involvement followed by their complete abandonment, their financial resources, and my ongoing medical needs. "Your Honor, the defendants didn't just stop visiting their daughter," Marcus emphasized. "They actively removed themselves from all financial and legal responsibility for her care while she was still unconscious, unable to advocate for herself. They changed their phone numbers, sold their home, and moved to another state without providing any contact information. They made these choices knowing that their daughter's insurance coverage had been exhausted and that she would face catastrophic financial consequences if she survived." My parents' attorney, Ms. Blackwell, argued that as an adult, I had no legal claim to ongoing support from my parents. "Miss Sullivan was 28 at the time of her accident, Your Honor. While her situation is certainly tragic, her parents have no legal obligation to support an adult child. They made the difficult but legal decision to retire after decades of work, as is their right." The judge turned to my parents directly. "Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, I'd like to hear from you why you felt it necessary to not only withdraw financial support but to make yourselves completely unreachable to the medical staff caring for your daughter." My father cleared his throat. His voice, once so familiar and authoritative, now sounded strained. "Your Honor, we were faced with an impossible situation. The doctors told us Amber might never wake up, or if she did, she might have permanent, severe disabilities requiring lifetime care. We had to make a difficult choice about our future." "And that choice required cutting all contact?" the judge asked, skepticism evident in her tone. "We couldn't bear to watch," my mother said quietly. "It was too painful." "Too painful for you," the judge noted. "Meanwhile, your daughter was fighting for her life." Ms. Blackwell jumped in. "Your Honor, my clients made emotionally difficult decisions during a time of extreme stress. They're not heartless people. They simply reached their breaking point after weeks of watching their daughter in a coma with no improvement." The judge turned to me. "Miss Sullivan, would you like to testify?" Marcus had prepared me for this moment. I took a deep breath, stood up with my cane, and made my way to the witness stand. After being sworn in, I faced the courtroom, deliberately avoiding looking directly at my parents. "Miss Sullivan," Marcus began gently, "could you tell the court about your relationship with your parents before the accident?" "We were close," I said, my voice steady. "Or at least I thought we were. I saw them every week for Sunday dinner. They were involved in all aspects of my life, my education, my career, even my living arrangements and relationships. They always said family was the most important thing." "And after your accident?" "I was in a coma for 3 months. I have some fragmented memories of hearing voices, including theirs, at first. Then those voices disappeared. When I woke up, I learned they had not only stopped visiting but had deliberately made themselves untraceable. They left me alone with catastrophic injuries, no resources, and no way to contact them." "What impact has their abandonment had on you?" This was the hardest question, the one we'd practiced most. I took a moment before answering. Beyond the obvious financial impact of being left with medical bills I can never repay, there's the complete destruction of everything I believed about my family. I've had to relearn how to walk, how to speak clearly, how to care for myself. But I've also had to relearn who I am, because so much of my identity was tied to being Richard and Karen Sullivan's daughter. They shaped every major decision in my life, always saying it was because they loved me. Now I know that love had conditions I didn't understand. Marcus nodded. What are you asking the court for today? I'm asking for financial support for my ongoing medical needs and rehabilitation. But I'm also asking for accountability. They made a choice that nearly destroyed me, and they need to face that choice directly, not from a comfortable distance in Florida. Ms. Blackwell's cross-examination was pointed but brief. She tried to establish that I had been an independent adult before the accident, undermining the dependency argument. But her questions only emphasized how involved my parents had remained in my life despite my age. Next came the medical testimony. My neurologist, Dr. Patel, explained the extent of my injuries, the unlikely but real nature of my recovery, and my ongoing medical needs. Nurse Rachel testified about my parents' decreasing visits and eventual disappearance. The hospital administrator detailed the conversations with my parents about costs and their formal notification that they would no longer be responsible for my care. Throughout all this, my parents sat stone-faced, occasionally whispering to their attorney but showing little visible reaction. When it was their turn to testify, my father went first. He spoke about the strain of watching me in the coma, the grim prognosis from the doctors, the mounting costs, and their decision to move on with the next phase of their lives. We'd worked hard our whole lives, he testified. We had to think about our future too. The money we'd saved for retirement would have been completely depleted. Did you explore all options for your daughter's care? Marcus asked during cross-examination. We were overwhelmed, my father admitted. The medical information was complicated. Did you consult with a social worker about assistance programs? No. Did you investigate long-term care insurance or disability benefits? Not specifically, no. Did you tell anyone at the hospital how to reach you after you moved? We felt a clean break would be easier. Easier for whom, Mr. Sullivan? My father didn't answer. My mother's testimony was similar, emphasizing their emotional distress, their fear of financial ruin, their belief that I might never recover. Throughout her testimony, she avoided looking at me directly. Mrs. Sullivan, Marcus asked, before the accident, how often did you tell your daughter you loved her? All the time, she said quietly. We were very close. And after the accident, when did you decide that love no longer obligated you to even be reachable in case she woke up? Objection. Ms. Blackwell interjected. Argumentative. I'll rephrase, Marcus said smoothly. Mrs. Sullivan, what specific date did you and your husband decide to change your phone numbers and move without providing contact information to the hospital? It was about 6 weeks after the accident, she admitted. The doctors had told us there was little chance of meaningful recovery. Yet here she sits, Marcus said, gesturing to me. Very meaningfully recovered. As the testimony continued, I reached into my purse and pulled out a small envelope that Marcus and I had discussed including in the evidence. It was my last birthday card from my parents, received just 2 months before the accident. When it was my turn to speak again, I asked permission to submit it to the court. The judge nodded, and the bailiff brought it to her. Your Honor, I said, I'd like to read what my parents wrote in this card. Judge Wells opened the card and nodded for me to continue. It says, to our precious daughter on her 28th birthday. From the moment you were born, you have been the light of our lives. We are so proud of the woman you've become and will always be there for you, no matter what life brings. That's what family means, being there through good times and bad. We love you more than words can say. Always, Mom and Dad. The courtroom was silent. I looked directly at my parents for the first time. I have just one question, I said, my voice breaking slightly. Why? My father's face had gone pale during the reading of the card. Now, he suddenly clutched his chest, his breathing becoming labored. He slumped forward onto the table. "Richard," my mother cried out, half rising from her seat. The courtroom erupted in commotion. The bailiff called for medical assistance. The judge ordered a recess. As they helped my father from the courtroom, my mother following anxiously behind, she finally looked at me fully. Her face crumpled, and she began to sob uncontrollably, needing to be supported by their attorney. The last thing I saw before they left the courtroom was my mother's face, a mask of shame, regret, and something that looked like recognition, as if she was truly seeing me for the first time since I'd awakened. Court reconvened the following morning. My father had suffered what the paramedics called a stress-induced anxiety attack, not a heart attack as initially feared. He was present in the courtroom, looking shaken but physically recovered. My mother sat beside him, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands clutching a tissue. Judge Wells wasted no time in delivering her ruling. Having reviewed the evidence and testimony in this unusual and troubling case, I find that the defendants, Richard and Karen Sullivan, did indeed violate their responsibilities under our state's filial responsibility statutes. While these laws are more commonly applied to adult children caring for elderly parents, the principles remain the same. Family members have obligations to one another in times of medical crisis and inability to self-support. She looked directly at my parents. The court is frankly disturbed by the calculated nature of the defendant's actions. This was not a heat-of-the-moment decision made under duress, but a deliberate choice to abandon their daughter at her most vulnerable moment and to take specific steps to prevent being contacted when she awoke. Judge Wells outlined her order. My parents would be responsible for my outstanding medical bills, the costs of my ongoing rehabilitation, and support for basic living expenses until I was able to return to full-time employment. Additionally, she ordered punitive damages to be placed in a trust for my long-term care needs. The court recognizes that this ruling will impact the defendant's retirement plans, she added. That is unfortunate but necessary. Actions have consequences, particularly actions that harm vulnerable individuals who cannot advocate for themselves. My parents sat with their heads bowed as the judge continued. Miss Sullivan has demonstrated remarkable courage and resilience in the face of not only catastrophic injuries but profound betrayal by those who should have been her strongest advocates. The court sincerely hopes that with the financial burden of her care now appropriately assigned, she can focus fully on her continued recovery. With that, she adjourned the court. It was over. We had won. Outside the courtroom, reporters approached with questions, but Marcus shielded me, making a brief statement that we were gratified by the court's decision and asking for privacy as I continued my recovery. As we prepared to leave, I saw my mother break away from their attorney and hurry toward me. Marcus moved protectively closer, but I touched his arm. "It's okay," I said. "I'll hear what she has to say." My mother stopped a few feet away, looking uncertain. Up close, I could see new lines around her eyes, a nervous tremor in her hands. "Amber," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you probably hate us. You have every right to." I didn't respond, just waited for her to continue. "What we did was unforgivable," she said. "I don't expect you to understand, much less forgive us. I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. So deeply sorry." "Where was this remorse when I was lying unconscious?" I asked quietly. "When the doctors were saying I might never wake up." She wiped at her tears. "I don't have a good answer." Fear took over. "Your father was so adamant that we needed to protect ourselves financially, and I went along with it. I've been going along with his decisions our whole marriage." "That's not an excuse," I said. "No, it's not," she agreed. "Nothing excuses what we did." "I can't talk about this right now," I told her, suddenly exhausted. "I need time." She nodded, taking a step back. "Of course. Whatever you need. I've written down our new contact information." She held out a small piece of paper. After a moment's hesitation, I took it. This doesn't mean I'm ready to have a relationship again, I warned her. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that. I understand, she whispered. Thank you for even speaking to me. As she turned to go, I called after her. Mom? Where's Dad right now? Talking with our attorney about the financial arrangements, she said. He's having a harder time accepting the ruling. Of course he was. My father had always hated losing control of anything, especially money. Tell him I don't want his money, I said. I want what that money represents, accountability. He doesn't get to walk away from this and pretend it never happened. She nodded and left, shoulders slumped, looking much older than she had in those beach photos. The aftermath of the court case brought a flurry of changes. The financial burden that had been hanging over my head was lifted. I could continue my rehabilitation with proper resources instead of being transferred to an under-equipped state facility. The punitive damages provided enough for me to rent a small, accessible apartment and cover basic expenses while I continued to recover. The media attention brought unexpected consequences too. Several local news outlets covered the story: parents abandon coma patient daughter, ordered to pay support. A few reporters framed it as a cautionary tale about healthcare costs and the burden of catastrophic injuries. Others positioned it as a moral failure, a betrayal of parental obligation. My parents' community in Florida learned about the case. According to their attorney, they faced significant social fallout, with neighbors and new friends distancing themselves after learning what they had done. I tried not to think about them as I focused on my recovery. With proper rehabilitation now financially secured, I made rapid progress. 3 months after the court case, I moved into my new apartment, a small one-bedroom on the ground floor of a building with elevator access and proximity to the rehabilitation center. Rachel helped me decorate it with second-hand furniture and cheerful prints. It wasn't the stylish Cambridge apartment I'd once had, but it was mine. I began working part-time remotely for a small marketing agency that Emily's brother owned. The work was basic compared to my former director-level position, but it gave me purpose and a way to rebuild my resume while working around my ongoing therapy appointments and cognitive limitations. Throughout this time, I received occasional emails from my mother. Brief, tentative messages asking how I was doing, never pushing for more than I was willing to give. I responded sporadically, with minimal details about my recovery progress. I wasn't ready for more. 6 months after the court case, my mother asked if she could visit me at the rehabilitation center. After discussing it with my therapist, I'd started seeing a psychologist to process the trauma and abandonment. I agreed to a brief meeting in the center's public cafeteria. She arrived alone, explaining that my father wasn't ready to face me yet. I wasn't surprised. She brought a small gift, a journal with a watercolor cover, and sat across from me, her hands fidgeting nervously. "You look well," she said. "The therapists here must be excellent." "They are," I replied. "I'm walking without the cane most days now. The cognitive therapy is helping with the memory issues too." An awkward silence fell. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low. "I need to tell you something about what happened, Amber. It won't change anything, but I think you deserve to know." I nodded for her to continue. "The decision to leave, it wasn't mutual, not really. Your father made the decision. He was fixated on protecting our retirement, convinced that your care would bankrupt us. When I expressed doubts, he said we had to be practical, that emotions couldn't factor into it." "And you went along with it," I said flatly. She nodded, looking down. "I've spent my whole life going along with your father's decisions. He's always been so confident, so certain he knows best. I told myself he was probably right, that the doctor said you might never wake up, but deep down, I knew it was wrong. I just wasn't strong enough to stand up to him." "That's who you've always been," I observed. "Even when I was growing up." "Dad decided, you agreed," I complied. "That was our family dynamic." She looked surprised, then thoughtful. "I never saw it that way before, but you're right. We thought we were guiding you, but we were controlling you." And when you couldn't be controlled anymore because you were in a coma, we abandoned you." Her honesty was unexpected and, in its way, more healing than any apology could have been. She wasn't making excuses, just acknowledging the truth. "We had to sell the condo in Florida to pay the settlement," she added. "We're renting a small apartment." I felt no satisfaction at this news, just a dull ache where my love for them used to be. "I'm not asking for sympathy," she said quickly. "We deserve the consequences. I just wanted you to know that I think about you every day, and I will never forgive myself for what we did." When our meeting ended, she asked if she could hug me. I hesitated, then shook my head. "I'm not there yet," I told her. "I don't know if I'll ever be there." She accepted this with sad resignation, promising to keep in touch through email if I was willing. As I watched her leave, I felt strangely empty, neither the closure I had hoped for nor the satisfaction of retribution. Just the recognition that some wounds change you permanently, even after they begin to heal. The holidays arrived, my first since awakening from the coma. Rachel invited me to join her family for Thanksgiving, and Emily included me in her Hanukkah celebration. I received carefully neutral holiday cards from my parents, which I placed on a shelf without displaying them. My father included a brief note saying he was coming to terms with the court's decision, not quite an apology, but perhaps as close as his pride would allow. I declined their tentative invitation to visit for Christmas, choosing instead to volunteer at the rehabilitation center with other patients who couldn't be with family. It felt right, somehow, finding meaning in supporting others who understood isolation and loss. As the one-year anniversary of my awakening approached, I realized I had built something I never expected, a life entirely of my own making, shaped by my choices alone. It wasn't the life I had planned, but increasingly, it was a life I valued. 1 year after waking from my coma, I stood in front of the mirror in my apartment, studying my reflection. The physical changes were obvious, the faint surgical scars along my hairline, the way I still leaned slightly to one right side when tired, the lingering thinness that months of physical therapy hadn't fully reversed. But the more profound changes weren't visible on the surface. I had learned to walk again, first with a walker, then a cane, and now mostly independently with just occasional balance issues. I had returned to modified full-time work, managing social media campaigns for the marketing agency where I'd started part-time. My cognitive abilities had improved dramatically, though I still dealt with occasional migraines and memory lapses when stressed. What no medical scan could show was how profoundly my understanding of family, love, and self-worth had transformed. The email communication with my mother had continued, evolving from stilted exchanges about my health to more meaningful, if careful, conversations. She had begun therapy herself, working to understand her role in the family dynamics that led to their abandonment decision. My father occasionally added brief notes to her emails, formal, reserved, but present in a way he hadn't been before. 3 months earlier, I had agreed to meet them both for coffee at a neutral location, a cafe halfway between my apartment and the modest rental where they now lived, having relocated back to Massachusetts after selling their Florida property. The meeting had been awkward, painful at times, but necessary. My father struggled to maintain eye contact, his once commanding presence diminished by shame and the consequences of his choices. "I made a terrible mistake," he had said finally, the words seeming to physically pain him. "I convinced myself I was being practical when I was really being selfish. I don't expect your forgiveness, Amber." "I'm not offering forgiveness right now," I'd replied honestly. "I'm offering a chance to see if there's anything worth rebuilding. That's all I can give right now." It was a start, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. We had met twice more since then, each interaction slightly less strained than the last. I doubted we would ever recapture the close relationship I'd once thought we had, but perhaps we could create something new, something based on honesty rather than control and dependence. The true family bonds I'd formed were with those who had stood by me through the darkest times. Rachel had become my closest friend, including me in family gatherings and bringing her children to visit me regularly. Her youngest daughter called me Auntie Amber and loved to bring me pictures she'd drawn during my recovery. Emily remained a fierce advocate and trusted advisor, helping me navigate the complex systems of medical care, insurance, and disability benefits.